it's hard to believe the fact that we are just 3 weeks away from decision day, and that it felt like the season just started yesterday, but here we are in the final stretch of the regular season, and in a stretch where pretty much every single game for each team is a very important game. And because of that, I thought I would spend this time to take a look at the standings as we're heading to the home stretch of the regular season, and taking a look at where everybody is right now, and we'll even look at the teams that is eliminated from the playoffs, because even though those teams are eliminated from the playoffs, they still have a lot of say in terms of this playoff race that is going on, and that they're basically act as the main spoiler in terms of some of these teams either gets to the playoffs or not make it to the playoffs, or get a better position in terms of making the playoffs, or even get a home field for the first round of the playoffs. Because keep in mind, teams that is below fourth place for both conferences will not get a home game in the playoffs, and that since this year the playoffs is all single elimination, and that there is no more second leg in the conference semifinal and the conference final, that means that if you want to host a playoff game, you better make sure you end up being the top 4 team in each conference. But we start off with the Eastern Conference, which we have NYCFC currently at the top of the Eastern Conference with a 16-9-5 record, and they have 57 points right now, and they have 4 games left of this season. The next game is going to be at FC Dallas, then they play against Atlanta, then at New England, and finally on decision day they are playing against the Union. And I have a feeling that this game against the Union could potentially be a game where it could decide first round bye. And did I also mention the fact that first round bye, unlike previous year where the first 2 team gets first round bye, this year only the top team in each conference gets first round bye, and that, we've seen many times before how important first round bye is, and that you get an extra week of rest heading into to the next round of playoffs. So for sure that both of those teams are going to maybe be fighting for that position on the final day of the season. Speaking of the Union, their record is 15-7-8, and they're currently 5 points behind NYCFC in terms of that top spot. Now, they of course have to go on the road to play against the Red Bulls next. Then they have to go on the road again on a short week to play against the Quakes, and that they have to, of course, fly all the way across the other side of the country, only on a 3-day rest to play against the Quakes on the road. Then they have to play against Columbus on the road before hosting NYCFC when they, of course, are back home. I know it says Philly here, but I accidentally mistaken the writing of that, and that it should have been NYCFC at that point. But, certainly I think Philly, they would hope that maybe NYCFC, of course, can drop some points, or even drop one of the game where they could head to that final game of the season, where if it's just less than a 3-point gap, then something tells me this could be a very interesting kind of matchup between NYCFC versus Philly, that this could really decide in terms of the first round bye. Now, another team that is not out of the picture of a first round bye in the top spot is Atlanta United, who currently have a record of 15-3-11, and they currently have 48 points right now. Tomorrow they're going to be playing against FC Cincinnati on the road before playing against the Quakes on the weekend, then go on the road against NYCFC, which they have a chance, if they can of course win that, they have a chance to gain 3 points on NYCFC. Then they got Montreal on the road before playing against New England at home. Now, there's no doubt that if you look at these 3 teams that I think could be the team that is going to be fighting for that top spot, there is no doubt that Atlanta has the easier schedule out of those 3 teams. However, since Atlanta is 9 points behind in that, since if they want to get the top spot, first of all, they need help from NYCFC and Philly, and also they got to make sure that they beat NYCFC when they, of course, are playing them on the road. Because if they do not beat NYCFC in this game, they are just going to lose ground, and I just don't see they're going to actually get a first round by heading into the playoffs and finish as the top spot in the Eastern Conference. Now, we then got TFC, who currently have a record of 12-9-10. And yes, TFC is actually now 4th in the Eastern Conference, and after just, remember how TFC was struggling so much in the middle part of the season, and that there was still a lot of question to the fact that whether if this team isn't even gonna make the playoffs in the first place. All of a sudden, they have gone on a very good run in that I believe they haven't lost a single game since August, and then that has now propelled themselves all the way up to 12, 9, and 10, and up to 4th place in the Eastern Conference. Currently have 45 points. Now, they have 3 games left this season. They have to go on the road against LAFC, which is going to be very tough. Then they have to go on the road against Chicago, and then play against Columbus at home. Now, the team that they might be fighting for that last spot in terms of at least getting a home game in the first round of the playoffs is going to be DC, who is also tied with them with 45 points and also have the same record as TFC had with a record of 12, 9, and 10. Now, their schedule down the stretch is not going to be easy too, because they have to play against Seattle at home. Then they, of course, play against the Red Bulls in that Atlantic Cup on the road before finishing off the season against FC Cincinnati at home. So, yeah, I think these 2 games could really potentially decide whether or not if either of these teams is going to heading into this final month, if one of these teams is going to be in a spot where they find themselves in 4th place of the Eastern Conference, then something tells me that they most likely can sustain that. Although, that being said, I don't want to... For TFC, if you look at the final game of the season compared to DC final game of the season, there's no doubt that DC has the easiest final game with playing FC Cincinnati home compared to playing against Columbus, which is a team that has definitely find some good form in the latter part of the season. Now, then we move on into 6th place, which is the Red Bulls, currently with a record of 12, 5, and 13, and they currently have 41 points, and they have 4 games left of this season, and it starts tomorrow when they play against Portland on the road. Then they, of course, play the Union at home, play DC at home, before finishing off the season against Montreal on the road. So they also have a relatively kind of easy schedule heading down the... Well, they kind of had a bit of a tough schedule heading down the stretch, but the last game of the season should be relatively easy as they play against a Montreal team that I know some people will think, well, Montreal is currently in 8th place and that, they should be a contender, and why would you think that it should be an easy game and that it might even set up Montreal potentially making the playoffs or not? Well, I'm going to explain why I think Montreal hope is all but done. Now, then you got New England, who is currently in 7th place, and their record is actually exactly at 10 apiece, with 10 wins, 10 draw, and 10 losses, and currently have 40 points so far. And I believe they actually drawn the most game out of any team this season. Well, actually, they're actually tied with Chicago in terms of the team that drawn the most game this season. And their remaining schedule, they got RSL at home. Then they got to play against Portland on the road, play against NYCFC at home, before going on the road. No doubt has one of the toughest game on decision day by going on the road to play against Atlanta United. And this is where when I look at that schedule for New England, I do have some concern of the fact that they could sustain in 7th place and able to just make it to the playoffs, because down the stretch they got some very tough schedule that they have to face. And considering the fact that you look at the teams that is just below the red line, you can see that those teams below the red line have by far much easier schedule than what New England has that is currently above the red line. And despite the fact that New England is 3 points up on those teams that is chasing them and also have a game in hand over all those teams that are chasing them, they, of course, have a very tough schedule compared to the teams that is below them. But talk about one of the teams that's below them, which is Montreal, and a team that I said that, the reason why I think they might not be in this hunt is because when you look at how bad Montreal has been in the last couple of games, unless if something really changed with this team where psychologically with them just realize that, hey, we can't just dick around with these resort anymore, and that these next couple of games we better start refocus and start winning some of those games, or else we're not even going to be in this playoff picture. And you could maybe say that with Piatti back in this starting 11, maybe that kind of re-energized this team. But other than that, I just don't see how potentially they could be in the race here. I mean, their record is 11-4-16 and currently have 37 points, and that they're only 3 points behind New England. But when you look at their next couple of games, they got the Galaxy on the road, and that Galaxy team just put 7 past Sporting KC in the last match week. So certainly that is definitely not a team you want to face on the road. Then they of course play against Atlanta, who definitely wants to beat Montreal in this game so that they, as I mentioned, they could potentially be at the top of the Eastern Conference and get a first round bye into this playoffs. And then they of course finish off the season against the Red Bulls, who the Red Bulls is another team that want to make sure that they of course secure their playoffs as we head after decision day is over. So that is definitely a very difficult schedule, and knowing how Montreal has been performing in the last couple of games, even against some easy opponents that they've been playing the last couple of games, they just have not done well. So what do I give them a chance if they cannot figure out those easy opponents now that they of course play against tough opponents in the next couple of games? Now, the two teams that I will say that I could maybe give them a chance to potentially catch New England for that spot, and probably this team I think could potentially catch New England and maybe even get above the red line, is Chicago, who you remember how a couple of months ago where I said Chicago was dead and buried and everything was doom and gloom. Well, all of a sudden, now they have a record of 9-10-12, and they're only 3 points behind New England, and that they have been in a very good form lately. And obviously, the other good news with Chicago is that they officially announced that they have changed ownership, and that they, of course, will be going back to Chicago and going to play Soldier Field for next season, and that they, of course, are leaving SeatGeek Stadium at the end of the year, and that you can clearly see there is some momentum and some rejuvenation with this franchise. And because of that, I think that's going to give Chicago a huge lift, and not to mention the fact that their schedule down the stretch could be very, very, very favorable in terms of them making the playoffs. I mean, the next game, they got the free game of the week with them playing on the road against FC Cincinnati. Then, of course, they play against Toronto at home, which is a little bit difficult, but they are playing them at home, which, Chicago this season, they have definitely been a much better team at home than they are on the road. And then the last weekend, they play against Orlando City, which I think this could be a game that, in case if New England did stumble heading into decision day, and that there's kind of like a free horse race in terms of seeing who is going to actually get into the playoffs, I think this game is going to really decide whether or not if each of these teams is going to make the playoffs, and that at the end of that game, the winner of that one could most likely be snatching that 7th and final spot in the playoff race. Now, heading into Orlando City's season down the stretch, they of course, by the way, they're currently 10th in the standing, and their record is 9-9-13, and that they currently are 4 points behind New England for that last spot of the playoffs. Well, their schedule is also pretty manageable too. They got Houston on the road, then FC Cincinnati on the road before playing against Chicago at home. So yeah, this is why I think this game between Orlando versus Chicago could really set up a case where, in case if New England did kind of stumble with this tough run, this could really set up a battle for the last position, and that the winner of that game will most likely snatch that 7th position in the playoffs. Now, when you look at teams that most likely is going to be eliminated and teams that have already been eliminated from the playoffs, you got Columbus, who is most likely going to be eliminated pretty soon, as they currently 6 points back of New England for that final spot, and that their record is 9-7-15, and barring any miracle, and that barring the fact that they win all 3 of their remaining game between Vancouver, Philly, and TFC, and depending on the fact that all the team that is above them just simply collapse and somehow they find their way back into the playoff race, I just think that Columbus most likely is done, and that, it's a matter of time before they are going to be eliminated this season. But they can still play the spoiler road with Philly and TFC as those two games. I mean, the next game against Vancouver is going to be one of those games where it's kind of the most unimportant game of the week because, both of these teams or at least one of these teams are already eliminated, and the other team that is facing against Vancouver, which is Columbus, is about to get eliminated. But speaking of elimination, that's what FC Cincinnati is. And FC Cincinnati, their record is 6-3-12, and they currently have 21 points. And despite the fact that you think their season is completely done and they don't have to worry about anything, not so fast. Because when you look at these next 4 games, they play against Atlanta at home, then play against Chicago at home, then play against Orlando City at home before finishing off the season on the road against DC. These are all teams that is either fighting for playoff position or teams that is trying to get a better position and trying to get home field advantage or even get a first round bye heading into the playoffs. So they could really be a big spoiler heading into the final part of the season. And I have no doubt that I know with FC Cincinnati, most likely they're done for the season. At least I think they should still they need to at least get some finish strong at the end of the season. I mean, I know it's been a terrible season for FC Cincinnati in their inaugural year, but if they can, of course, able to finish the season strong with getting at least a couple of wins out of these opponents or even getting a point out of these opponents, then they're definitely going to be feeling very good about themselves. The fact that, hey, even though we finished dead last in the Eastern Conference, and even though we're one of the worst teams in the expansion year, at least we did a great job in terms of the spoiler road, and that you can maybe build that into next season as a year that they, of course, could try to improve in terms of how they finish this season. Now, as I finished talking about the Eastern Conference, now let's move on to the Western Conference because, oh boy, the Western Conference, you've been hearing me talking about how the Western Conference is incredibly crazy. Yeah, I'm about to break down why it is incredibly crazy and that there is definitely a lot of scenario that is still kind of undecided as we're heading into the next couple of weeks. And believe it or not, there's going to be a lot of flip-flop that is going to be happening in the Western Conference. And not just, in this midweek action, but also heading into the weekend game. But we start off at first play with LAFC currently have a record of 19-7-4. Yeah, that is just absolutely outrageous, the fact that they are just by far the best. It's not even close in terms of them being at the top of the Western Conference and the team that is just below them. They have a 15-point gap on them, and I believe they already clinched their spot in terms of finishing top of the Western Conference. So they, of course, going to be clinching to become the first team to, of course, get a first round bye heading into the playoffs. But you look at the last 4 games that they have, they got TFC at home, Houston at home, Minnesota on the road, and Colorado at home. And there's no doubt that, with those games, I think those games are relatively easy and that you could say that most likely they're going to win most of those games. Although one thing I will also say is, if you're Bob Bradley, knowing the fact that you most likely is going to clinch Supporters Shield heading into this weekend game against TFC, do you start think about resting some of your guys so that they could, of course, be fresh heading into the playoffs? I mean, they're already going to get a extra break to the other team in the Western Conference because of that first round bye, but do they necessarily need to just keep resting guys so that they, of course, don't get injured in the last couple of weeks when they're playing some of those meaningless games? I mean, that's definitely an interesting kind of factor that Bob Bradley has done. And keep in mind, just because you decide to rest your team heading into the playoffs and you think it's a good thing, well, if you rest them too much and that you basically rest some of your best player for maybe 3 or 4 games in a row, that's actually not a good thing to have, because once playoff begins and when that intensity in the playoffs is going to be much higher in the regular season, and then you have guys that's been resting for 4 weeks because they have been playing some meaningless game, that's a dangerous thing to have for LAFC, and that those guys, if they're rested so much that they're started build some rust and that they don't get back into that intensity factor of an MLS game, that's when it could create a huge problem for LAFC. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what are they going to do once they clinch Supporter Shield, and that, whether or not if they're going to decide to rest some of their guys. But then we get into what is known as the logjam of the Western Conference, where between 2nd through 8th place is only separated by 6 points. And then we start off the logjam with Seattle currently have a record of 14, 7, and 9, and they currently have 49 points. The last 4 games of their season, they of course play Dallas at home this Wednesday before going on the road to play DC United away over the weekend. Then they go on the road again to play the Quakes in the next weekend's matchup before finishing the season at home against Minnesota. Now, for Minnesota themselves, they currently have a record of 14, 6, and 10, and they currently have 48 points. And that, as I said many times before with Minnesota, they have a very tough run heading down the stretch, and it is an example of that when you see how they have to play against the Timbers on the road in the next game. Then, of course, they're probably going to get the easiest game of this tough run against Sporting KC, who, I think they're most likely done in terms of their chances of making the playoffs. But now, after that, they play against LAFC, which, like I said about LAFC, whether or not if they rest their guys or not, that might be in some way kind of a blessing for Minnesota, with the fact that if LAFC do decide to rest some of their guys heading into the playoffs, that might be relatively an easy game. But still, it's LAFC, and that whenever it doesn't matter if you play the best LAFC team or a B squad that LAFC fields, it is always going to be a tough game. And then they finish the season off against Seattle, which is one of the tougher game and a team will have to face heading into decision day. Now, in 4th place, we got RSL currently have a record of 14, 4, and 12, and there's no doubt that I think RSL might have the easiest run heading down the stretch out of all these teams that is in that log jam of a Western Conference. They got New England on the road, which is probably going to be the toughest game that they're going to be facing. But then they, of course, got the Galaxy at home. Then they got Houston at home before going on the road against Vancouver, who has already been eliminated this season. So there's no doubt that they can definitely make some moves and maybe get themselves up in the Western Conference if they can, of course, start a good run heading down the stretch. And that also brings us to the Galaxy, who currently have a record of 14, 3, and 13, and they currently have 45 points. And I think besides RSL, that has maybe the easiest run out of all these teams that is log jamming in the Western Conference. They probably also are the second team to have the easiest schedule down the stretch, with them playing against Montreal at home, then go on the road against RSL, which is going to be very tough because RSL usually do not lose at home. Then they play against Vancouver at home before going on the road against the Dynamo, which I want to say that's an easy game, but I don't really want to, I'm pretty sure the any Galaxy fan do not want me to mention what happened last year on decision day and how they thought that was an easy game, and look what happened. I mean, again, I don't have to mention because you probably already know what happens. But then it brings us to the San Jose Earthquakes, which is my team, currently have 13, 5, and 12 record and currently have 44 points. And unlike in the previous 2 teams that I said that they have an easy stretch down the run, yeah, the Quakes have anything but an easy stretch, and they probably have the toughest stretch down the road, with them playing Atlanta on the road this weekend, which is going to be an impossible game, and I just don't expect anything out of that one. Then they, of course, play at home against Philly, which is another tough game, even though this game is at home, which we've been so good this season. Then we play against the Sounders at home before going on the road in the final day of the week to play against the Timbers, and that we are one of those teams that will have a very tough game to play heading into decision day. And especially the fact that going on the road against the Timbers, and that of all the games that we play against Portland, we have never won once against the Portland Timbers on the road. So the odds of the Quakes definitely needs to get a win heading into decision day if they want to make the playoffs is going to be highly likely, but I just hope that that will not be the case where, we have to win against Portland if we want to make the playoffs, because that would just be a very, very, very tough task, and that it would be a very unlikely task, and that they have to do something that they have never done in their franchise history to able to accomplish that. Now, speaking of the Timbers, their current record is 13-4-12, and they're actually just below the Quakes and in the last spot of the Western Conference in terms of the playoff spot. They currently have 43 points right now, and they have 5 games left this season, which means that they actually have the most game out of any team in the Western Conference right now. Their last 5 games would include a game against the Red Bulls, which is really their game in hand that they will have on Wednesday at home. Then they play against Minnesota at home before playing New England again at home, and that they will play their last road game against Sporting KC before finishing the season against the San Jose Earthquakes at home. And that, as I mentioned with my fear with the fact that heading into that final game and that we could be facing a scenario that we have to win against the Timbers if we want to get above the red line, and that could also be a game that I could say is something similar to what I said about Chicago versus Orlando City, and heading into the final game of the season where, the winner of that game most likely will make the playoffs, and the loser of that game will most likely miss the playoffs. Now, one thing I will say is that the team that is currently below the red line, Dallas, could be, with me worrying the fact that that could be a scenario. One thing I will be a little bit kind of less worried, and maybe that, of course, won't be the scenario, is that Dallas themselves are currently below the red line, and that they are going to be facing a very daunting kind of last 4 game of the season. I mean, their current record is 12-7-11, and they also have 43 points right now. But when you look at their last 4 games of the season, they have to go on the road against Seattle in tomorrow's matchup before playing at home against NYCFC, which is definitely not an easy task to do. Then they go on the road against the Rapids, which you think that it's an easy game until you realize that the Rapids are probably the best team in terms of spoiling chances of a team making the playoffs or getting in a better playoff position. Then they finish off the season against Sporting KC, which, that might be the easiest game that they have run in terms of the last 4 games of the season, but still, it is still a very kind of daunting task, and that, I just think that heading into the last couple of weeks this season, when you look at the playoffs, I know I have heard a lot of people say that this could be a free horse race in terms of deciding those last 2 spots left in the playoff picture, and I definitely don't disagree in terms of that. It looked like most likely, there's going to be 3 teams out of everything that is set is going to be fighting for those last 2 spots, and one of those teams will most likely, or I shouldn't even say most likely, but will be missing the playoffs and will be the odd man out. Now, looking at 9th place, we got Sporting KC, who currently have a record of 10-7-13, and they currently have 37 points. And, Sporting KC, they're technically still alive in terms of the playoff chances, but, their hopes in terms of making the playoffs, or even in this conversation of making the playoffs, has dramatically turned horribly in these last 2 games, with them losing 7-2 against the Galaxy, then losing 2-1 against the Timbers. And when you look at the last couple of games that they have, and actually, just like what I said earlier here with me accidentally putting Philly as the one of the last opponents that they will place in these games, I did the same thing with Sporting KC, and that no, Sporting KC is not playing themselves in the next game. Who is Sporting KC playing in the next game? Let's see. If I can find SKC name right now, I can. Oh yes, it's Colorado. that is going to be playing against SKC. So that should have been the Rapids that Sporting KC is playing. And then, of course, they go on the road against Minnesota, then play against Portland before playing against Dallas. So, the last 2 games of the season, they are playing against 2 teams that is just above them in the playoffs, which that's what I kind of think that maybe they're not done in terms of making the playoffs. But, as I said, last 2 resort of how horribly it has gone wrong for Sporting KC, and that I just don't know, when you look at these last 2 resort, is it really just kind of just a final nail in the coffin in Sporting KC chances of making the playoffs, and that they're just so mentally fatigued after what happened in the last 2 resort that they just have nothing left in the tank in terms of perseverance to trying to get above the red line. But then we got 10th place, which is the Rapids, who currently have a record of 10, 6, and 15. They currently have 36 points right now, and their last 3 game is against Sporting KC, Dallas, and going to be playing against LAFC on the road. And that the next 2 games, they have another chance to try to spoil Sporting KC and Dallas' chances of making the playoffs, and I will not be surprised if they are able to either pick up points against those 2 opponents or even win both of those opponents, because this Colorado team, this is a team that when you face them, even though I think that they're gonna, of course, miss the playoffs and that they're on the brinks of elimination, they're definitely not acting like they're on the brinks of elimination. They're acting like every game still matters now, and that this team is going to be a team that you definitely do not want to face if you have playoff kind of hopes that is still hanging in the balance as we head down the stretch. Now, then we get into 11th place, which is Houston, who currently have a record of 10, 4, and 6, and they currently have 34 points. And I believe in the next game against Orlando City, if they don't win that one, I think they're going to be officially eliminated from the playoffs. Then they got LAFC on the road, and then RSL on the road before finishing the season against the Galaxy. And, as I said, if they don't win that game against Orlando City, they will probably be eliminated from the playoffs. But as that's it, even if they stay alive in terms of the playoff race by winning against Orlando City, you look at the next 2 games against LAFC and RSL that they have to go on the road to play against. Those are probably most likely the games that it's going to really be the final nail in the coffin for the Dynamo, and that they course officially eliminated from the playoffs. And speaking of elimination, one team that is eliminated from the playoff is Vancouver, and I'm just gonna make this short for the Whitecaps, who currently have a record of 7, 9, and 15, and currently have 30 points. And that, the last 3 games that they got Columbus, the Galaxy, and RSL that they have to play. The Galaxy match is going to be on the road, and as much as I want Vancouver to be like FC Cincinnati, where they might play a little bit of a spoiler road in terms of trying to spoil some chances for teams that is going to either make the playoffs or get in a better position in terms of the playoff race. I just don't know if that is going to happen. Like, at best, they can maybe spoil the Galaxy chances of getting home field advantage in the first round, and maybe spoil the chances of RSL getting home field advantage heading into the playoffs. But yeah, I just don't know if that is going to happen, considering how bad this team has been for the last couple of games. But either way, guys, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys give a like, smash that subscribe button. I know this has been a long video because not only I look at the standings, but I also look at each team's last couple of games before the regular season ends. But either way, guys, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know in the prediction below, what do you think the final standings is going to look like? Who do you think is going to finish top in each of the conference? Well, actually, I'm pretty sure you know who's going to finish top in the Western Conference, because it's already decided that LAFC have clinched the top spot in the Western Conference. But who's going to finish top in the Eastern Conference, and who exactly is going to get home field advantage, at least in the first game of the playoffs? And most importantly, when you look at the teams that is on the bubble, who is going to have their bubble burst by the end of the season, and that they're going to be kind of like the odd man out of not making the playoffs heading into the end of the regular season. But let me know in the comments below. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.